Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, July 23rd around here. We are 31 days out from football being underway, and we got some things to talk about. We're going to start talking a little bit about SEC Media Days. A number of things went on in Atlanta this past weekend, about 10 minutes up the road from me, actually. So we're getting into that, talk mainly about that 8 versus 9 conference game schedule. Been a big topic of conversation, so we'll jump into that to start. Then we got a couple of different things. We're going to talk a little bit about the blue chip ratio. That's a big thing that has come out the last couple of years, really dating back to 2011-ish, and there's been a common theme between the national champions and their blue chip ratio. We'll get into that and why it might be changing sometime soon with the transfer portal being such a huge part of college football. Then we'll get to a little bit of a Monday catch-up. We got to talk about Jake Retzlaff finding his way down to New Orleans to join Tulane. We got to talk about a couple of different things, including Texas and Georgia getting into a little bit of a rivalry when you go to the recruiting trail. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing. A number of things to get to here, but let's talk about SEC Media Days. I'll be totally honest, it was not necessarily an explosive media days from the SEC. A lot of coaches going about their business, doing the coach speak that they need to, talking about their GPAs, giving a shout out to Greg Sankey, doing all the things that they had to do, and not much else. There wasn't really an incredible storyline coming out of this week, but there were some things to talk about, and we'll get to one crazy take from Eli Drinkwitz at the very end. But let's start with the biggest conversation probably in college football right about now, at least as we get closer to the season. People are trying to find things to talk about, and this has been one of the bigger ones. Is the SEC, currently at an 8-game schedule, has talked about going to a 9-game schedule. Some different coaches in the past have said they're very much in favor. Some other coaches, I'm sure, have said they're not so much in favor because they play an SEC schedule. They feel that they play the toughest schedule in the country regardless of how many conference games they play, 8 or 9. And I understand the argument from both sides here. So I think the 8-game schedule is one thing that, especially in a conference with 16 different teams, you're going to have a lot of variance in the schedule. That's why me personally, I'm in favor of a 9-game schedule for the SEC. I think it makes the most sense. I think it gives you an ability to have another data point on the sheets to go to when you talk about the playoff, and you have a number of different big-time games that can be slotted in, whether that's Texas LSU or Alabama, Florida, whoever you want to put in there. There's a number of different things you can do with that final spot to make it more interesting. The other idea that I've heard out there is you play 8 conference games. Everyone plays 8 conference games, including the Big Ten, including the Big 12. Now, that might be a little bit harder to get them to sign off on, but at the end of the day, everyone could find their way back to 8 games, and then you have to play 2 out-of-conference games against Power 4 competition. Would love that as well. At the end of the day, for me, I would love every single Power 4 team to play 10 Power 4 teams every single year, regardless if it's 8 or 9 conference games. I don't much care, if I'm being totally honest with you, but at the end of the day, I do think that 9th conference game is a very interesting idea. There is one thing that I do want to say here is I understand the conversation around strength of schedule has gotten a little bit toxic at times. It's gotten a little bit confusing of what makes a team strong going into a season comparative to the last season. How do you come back if you're 90th in the country in strength of schedule, but you end up beating some really good teams throughout the year? Do you have the ability to close the gap against a team that was top 5 to start the year? And when should we really start strength of schedule rankings? I tend to believe it should be about a month, maybe 6 weeks into the season as we see these teams develop and we get a better idea of what these teams are. One thing I will say, if the SEC does add a 9th game to their conference schedule, if they add a game like Alabama against Texas or Alabama against Florida or something like that, you better be ready for an SEC team to lose 4 games and find their way into the playoff, because that is the reality that you're opening yourself up to. They win the strength of schedule battle, and we can talk about whether that's fair. We can talk about the way that they go about strength of schedule all day till the cows come home, no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, the SEC wins that battle right now. We know that very, very obviously, and that's no question for anyone involved. If you add another game to their schedule, they're going to win it by a massive margin. They're going to be able to totally push out the way of a 9-3 Alabama is going to be able to push out an 11-1 Iowa State, hypothetically. That's going to be the battle that you're up against. And I think when you look at a 9-game schedule for the SEC, you already see the gap that's there. When you talk about strength of schedule, I believe 9 of the top 10 teams in the SP Plus strength of schedule are in the SEC. that's going to get more aggressive if you add that ninth game. So I totally understand people wanting the SEC to go to 9 games. I think I would lean towards the 8 game for everyone in the country, and then you have to play 2 Power 4 teams every single year. But that's a total semantics battle that obviously can be hashed out over the next couple of years. My argument is as simple as the SEC dominates the strength of schedule battle. We know it factors into the CFP. Whether it should or not is a debate that we can have, but we know that it factors in right now. You give them another SEC team on that schedule, I think we all know the gap between the SEC and everyone else when it comes to perceived strength of schedule is going to be that much bigger. So I'm in favor of whatever they do. I want there to be I want there to be just outright standards of how teams go about seasons, how teams go about scheduling. I don't think anyone should be able to play an FCS team, but understand there are some financial things that help the FCS team out in that scenario. There's some different things to overcome, no doubt about that, but I just want a uniform scheduling model across the sport. I'd love strength of schedule to be figured out maybe midway through the season instead of 3 months before the season. There's a lot of different kinks to work out. Just to say, in the short term, if the SEC were to add another conference game, they're going to get the benefit of the doubt a little bit more than some of these people that want them to add that ninth conference game would love for them to get. So that's going to be a battle back and forth and definitely will be interesting to watch. I don't think they're in a rush to go to 9 games, so I tend to believe it'll be 8 games for the foreseeable future, but maybe we have some schedule regulations that come into play and you have to schedule this amount of opponents, then we could have a real conversation. But right now, it's definitely time to get to some football because this is something that pops up right around this time every single year. Then we got to talk about Texas. They were picked to win this conference this year. It was a relatively close poll. When you look at the number 1 picks, the teams to win the championship, according to the media, Texas does have a favorable lead there. More than double of what Georgia has. Then you have Alabama, LSU right there with 29 and 20 votes respectively. Then you got a little bit of a hodgepodge. You got South Carolina at 5. They got 5 first place votes. Oklahoma got 3, but they're all the way down at 10 overall in the rankings. But they were one of the top teams when it comes to possibly winning the SEC. And then Vandy got 2 votes to win the SEC, not necessarily backing that too much. Florida got a couple, then Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Auburn all got 1 pick to win the SEC. But the way it shook out was relatively the way that I saw it. There's some teams on here that I'm a little bit more bullish on, some teams I'm a little bit more nervous about, but this kind of shook out the way that I expected it. I think a lot of people took exception with Texas being up there, but let's be totally honest, it's a very, very talented team with a quarterback that is going to get love. Whether or not he's going to fulfill that, we'll find out. But at the end of the day, it was definitely the team that I expected to be picked, and that's exactly how it went down. And we'll get into kind of details. I'll do a kind of fun segment on next show where I do buy and sell the teams that I'm buying this year, the teams that I'm selling for this year, and we have a couple of teams on here that I'm both buying and selling. So we'll get into that on Friday, but Texas wins the at least preseason award, I suppose, for the SEC championship, but plenty of work to do on the field, obviously, for the Longhorns. This was a little bit of news that Greg McElroy just had to sneak in before SEC Media Days got underway. This was something that really kind of fizzled out in a hurry. Let's just be totally honest. It was a great about 12 hours to really kind of enjoy that. Think about, him finding his way back to Alabama. Maybe Kalen DeBoer goes to the NFL and Nick Saban finds his way back. Maybe Brian Kelly gets fired over there in Baton Rouge and Nick Saban finds his way back there. Frankly, I wanted them to coach at Toledo or Kent State because that would have been incredible. It would have been awesome theater. But at the end of the day, Nick Saban, he's not finding his way back to college football. Now, he will always be involved. He's going to be on College Game Day, of course, again this year. He's going to be around the Alabama program, and really any program that he is allowed to be around, he will be around. I can promise you that. But he's an incredible guy around the sport. I think he's done coaching. So I think mainly the head coaches in the SEC do not have to worry about this guy coming back into the mix. I think he's happy where he's at, and it sounds like his daughter backed that up as well. So Nick Saban's going to stay where he is, I assume, but maybe if the right situation comes open, maybe we see him back in football, but I'd be very surprised. I think he does a great job with where he's at right now. I think he's happy with where he's at right now. And then this one. This was one that was one of the more confusing and one of the more debated topics coming out of SEC Media Days, although it was relatively silent. There wasn't this massive upswell of noise, but in terms of the SEC people talking about it, there was a lot of conversation about that. And essentially the SEC is introducing a new rule. They're deciding to introduce a delay of game on the defense, and this is something that has already been in place. The defense can get a delay of game for clapping during a snap count because a lot of teams do a clap for a snap count. Not that John Gruden loves that very much, but at the end of the day, a lot of teams love to do the clap for the snap count. A lot of defenses will decide to clap during that, and that's obviously something that has been kind of taken out of the game a little bit. You will get a delay game on the defense maybe once every 3 games or so, but this new one is a little bit different. This new one is if there's any abrupt movements at the line of scrimmage as they're getting into their cadence, as they're getting into their snap count, that will be a defensive delay game. And that's caused kind of a lot of questions about how this rule is going to be implemented more than anything else. And the biggest thing is about stemming. Now, if you don't know what stemming is, it's essentially when you have a lineman or 2 linemen in a certain spot and they flip right before the snap. So maybe they're in the 3 tech and they find their way over to 1 tech. They're right over the center, or maybe they're at the 1 tech at the beginning and then they find their way outside to right outside the guard and they're in the 3 tech. So that's kind of the battle that you're fighting. It's definitely something that happens very often. Those 2 teams that I have on the screen right there, Tennessee and Georgia, might do it more than anyone else in the entire country. It doesn't sound like that will get penalized. It doesn't sound like if 2 guys start in one position and then slide to the other side of the line, it sounds like that's more than fine. The problem will come in if those 2 guys move, and then maybe there's a 3rd guy on the line of scrimmage that fakes to move and then doesn't. That will be called. That will be kind of the gray area of this. How intense is this going to be in terms of how it's rolled out? How many guys are going to get penalized for just barely moving? How many guys are going to get penalized for not moving at all, but it looked like they were moving as all the craziness was happening at the line of scrimmage? It is going to be really crazy, and I can almost promise you at some point this season, you're going to see Kirby Smart lose his mind over this call, whether it's his 2 guys moved and they saw another guy flinch, or his 2 guys moved and they didn't do it the right way. There's a lot of different things that possibly could go wrong here. What I can promise you is defensive coaches are not going to enjoy this one. It's going to be very confusing. It's going to be relatively hard, and I think there's going to be some calls that make Kirby Smart, make Glenn Schumann, make Pete Kwiatkowski and all the guys around the SEC just a little bit upset. I don't think it should be a huge deal. I like to think that they'll be implemented the correct way and it won't be aggressive. I think there's a world where it gets a little bit out of the lines and definitely gets a little bit sketchy for these defenses, but obviously something that we'll be able to judge a little bit better down the road. But overall, definitely an interesting thing to watch and could change the course of some games depending on how aggressive this call is. But some other things to talk about, just some other news. Eli Drinkwitz had maybe the worst CFP idea I've ever heard in my life. He said we wanted to move to 30 teams with different play-ins, 8 teams from the SEC, 8 teams from the Big 12, or Big 10, 8 teams from the Big 12 would be awesome. But at the end of the day, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to, mince words here. At the end of the day, that is a very fun idea and something that I'm sure some people wrote very interesting articles about. I have no desire to go to that level. So we'll find a way to get around to that. There's a lot of expansion talk going on right now, and we'll talk about that a little bit on Friday. And then Hugh Freeze, his golf game got brought up just a little bit. A lot of people were talking about how Hugh Freeze hasn't done enough recruiting, how he played 11 rounds of golf in the month of May, which is a lot of rounds of golf in the month of May for a football coach. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a huge story. I think it's going to be funny to talk about. I'll tell you that. I definitely think a lot of these meme accounts around college football are going to get some good mileage out of that this upcoming season if it does not go Auburn's way. And then Kalen DeBoer just seems more confident. That was my biggest takeaway from his time. It just felt like he has a better hold on this program, has a better understanding of what it means to be the Alabama head coach, because it was a little bit touch and go there for a little bit. I don't think he was able to be the coach that he's capable of being. I don't think he was able to be tough on those guys the way that he wanted to. I think now he can, and I think those guys really emulated that, and it'll be awesome to watch. Cannot wait to talk about this Alabama team in more depth because they have some freaks all over the place, and we'll talk about it actually in this next segment. We got to talk about blue chip ratio. It's a huge thing the last couple of years and something that really does guide us when we talk about the national champion, who can actually win the national championship in 2025. But we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about SEC Media Days. Not an explosive week in Atlanta by any means, not anything crazy, not too many shots taken or anything like that. In fact, we'll talk about something off the field that might have been the story of the SEC Media Days, had nothing to do with what was going on in Atlanta. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but let's talk about blue chip ratio here for a second because it has become a very important thing over the last about 15 years, really the last 20 years in college football. A lot of things going on, and the reality is, among transfer portal and NIL and all of this crazy stuff going on, high school recruiting still wins. At the end of the day, most national champions just find a way to get the best players out of high school and hold on to those guys. And the biggest example of this is the last couple of champions. You go all the way back really to 2011, and you will find that you got to be over 50% if you're going to find a way to win the national championship. If you do not have 50% of your guys, and blue chip players, just to give everyone an idea here, is 5 or high 4 stars. Just really, really the elite talent in every single year. However many of those guys are on your roster at that time is how you kind of calculate this. So as you see last year, Ohio State, 90% of those guys were the elite of the elite recruits. That was the best number of the last 15 years. As you can imagine, that roster was absolutely ridiculous, just littered with guys. Quinshawn Judkins and Caleb Downs came in as former 5-star guys. So an incredible team they built up there, and another reason why they just had to win the national title. But then you go back a little bit. Michigan was only 54%. So there's 3 teams on this list. You have 2023 Michigan, you have 2013 FSU, and you have 2016 Clemson. Those teams were only a little bit above 50. So those are the teams that have been a little bit close to kind of breaking this trend, or at the very least played a team that was very close to breaking this trend. Washington was under this 50% model in 2023. TCU was under it in 2022 when they played Georgia. Now, they didn't come close to winning that game, but at the end of the day, it does show that the transfer portal is changing this a little bit because the transfer portal players don't factor into this. The reality is, if you go into the portal and you were a 3-star in high school, that's how you apply to the new team, is a 3-star on their, at least on their blue chip ratio ratings, which is a little bit unfair at times. You know, a guy like Trevor Pena finding his way to Penn State this upcoming year, that boosts their overall talent, but will not boost their blue chip ratio. So that's a little bit of the back and forth that we have going on right now with this, but it is a good moniker. It is a good idea for who can actually win a national championship in any given year. It's usually going to be the teams that are above 50% for sure on blue chip ratio, and the majority of the time it's going to be the teams above 60% on the blue chip ratio. And let's look at the teams that are above that 50% moniker going into this year. And it starts with Alabama. Alabama has dudes all over that team. It is absolutely ridiculous, the talent on that roster. Ohio State did not drop far after last year, only down to 89%. Also, all the teams with the little asterisk next to them, that's just the teams that I have picked. So Alabama is obviously one of them. Ohio State's obviously one of them. Georgia coming in at 84%. And then you got Texas A&M. And Texas A&M actually was not on my list of teams that I thought could win a national title. I feel a little bit up in the air about that right about now, and we'll talk about A&M on Friday, I assume. But at the end of the day, that's the number one team of you have the most talent, and I'm not picking you as one of the teams that can win the national title. I'm sure they'd love to prove me wrong, but I have enough questions about that A&M team. I think they're going to be a really good team. But at the end of the day, to win a national title, I just can't fully buy into that. Now, you still have some really great teams here. You have Oregon, Texas right under them at 78%. Obviously, both of them were on my list. LSU, Notre Dame right after that. And then you get to an Oklahoma team at 70%. Was not on my list either. And I don't necessarily disagree with not putting them there. I do not think Oklahoma can win a national title. I do think they can be good enough to be a top 10 team. I think they play a remarkably hard schedule, which makes that a little bit more hairy, but at the end of the day, I think this Oklahoma team is very, very for real. Obviously has the talent to get it done. A lot of things have to come into play for them to finally get over that hump and even make the playoff, and then you got to win 4 more games to win a national title. So that's going to be a battle back and forth. Will definitely be interesting to watch what the Sooners can do, but the talent level is not the question over there. I can promise you that. Then you got Penn State at 68. You know, it's find their way up the last couple of years, but it's still a little bit below the elite teams in terms of a talent level overall. They got plenty of talent at Penn State. I'm not worried about that roster. It is one of the very best, maybe the very best roster in the entire country. but it definitely, from a recruiting standpoint, is not quite on par with some of the elite teams in the country. Miami found their way up this list very quickly. They are on my list of teams that could win a national title. I think if Carson Beck puts it together, that could be a really, really good football team that is able to do some real damage in a questionable conference in the ACC. I still very much like that conference, but I think when you look at those two teams that are on this list, Miami and Clemson, those are probably the teams setting the pace. And then you got some Louisville's, Georgia Tech, some really fun teams in there as well. Florida and Auburn, they were not on my list. I'm thinking about putting Florida on there. I got to be totally honest. I think that team has the top level talent to play with the elite teams in the country. I think cannot speak higher of DJ Lagway, and we'll get into my quarterback ratings actually on Friday as well. And we'll talk about DJ Lagway in that segment, of course. But then you got Michigan, USC, Clemson there at 55%, so not quite to that elite level. I mean, I think we saw that kind of play out against a Georgia team or a South Carolina or a Texas last year. You saw there was a little bit of a gap between the physical ability. Maybe not so much South Carolina, but definitely Georgia and definitely Texas. There was a gap between the talent level of those two teams, and this kind of bears that out. And then Tennessee and Florida State joining this group for the first time this year. Tennessee's been recruiting at a great level. No matter what Nico Iamaleava's dad would like to tell you, the talent is only getting better over there in Knoxville. And then Florida State, they're not going to win a national title. I feel very confident telling you that right now. They better be better than 2-10. I can promise you that. With that roster, you better be able to at least get to a bowl game. It's a good group of teams. I think I didn't have A&M or Oklahoma on my list of teams that could win a national title. I thought about putting Florida on there, but just couldn't pull the trigger there. And then Auburn has the talent. That's not a new thing around there. They absolutely have the talent to get it done, especially at the wide receiver position. I worry about Hugh Freeze. I'll just be totally honest. Michigan is always going to be in this group. Same thing with USC. And Florida State, I think, is going to stick around here now. If you fall off a cliff again for the second straight year and Mike Norvell's out the door, that could become sketchy times over there in Tallahassee in a hurry. But these are your teams. These are the teams that are above 50%, and there are some teams missing from this thing. There's no doubt about that. And there's a couple of teams that I wanted to highlight right here that possibly could win it all. Now, we'll start with Ole Miss because that feels like the safest one of these. The talent level is for real. There's no doubt about that. I love Austin Simmons. I think he is going to be one of the biggest stories of this college football season. I think Caden Lee's a guy that people don't realize how good that kid is, and they will this year. South Carolina is absolutely on this list as well. I cannot say enough good stuff about Lenora Sellers. I think he's going to be an incredible player. Have some big questions on the defensive side of the ball, losing some elite players like Kyle Kennard, like Demetrius Knight Jr. It's going to be tough to replace those guys. But I think when you have a quarterback of that caliber and especially that physical ability, I think you got a shot to do some special stuff. And then I did have Texas Tech and Arizona State on my list from a couple of weeks ago. I don't feel great about it. I'll be totally honest with you. I wanted to give the Big 12 some love in that segment. I can't imagine these teams win the national title. I think it would be an incredible story if a team from Lubbock did an incredible thing and found their way to the national title. Arizona State obviously building something very special under Kenny Dillingham and being able to parlay that into a title in the second big-time year there. That would be incredible. I just don't see the talent level like we were just talking about. Even Clemson to Georgia, Clemson to Texas was a pretty noticeable gap when you talk about the talent level, especially along the lines of scrimmage. Both these teams did a great job. Texas Tech did a fantastic job on the lines of scrimmage this offseason, but I just don't know if it meets that level. I'd love to believe that they can do it, and maybe I'll talk myself into it before the season starts, but those are the two teams that I'll put there with a question mark, at least for the time being. Really like what they've built, and maybe if it's a 2007 type year, they can find their way up there. But it's going to be really awesome to watch. There's no doubt about that. I think when you add transfers into this conversation, I think it gets a little bit more murky, right? You can add some really, really talented transfers that were 3 stars or even 2 stars coming out of high school that are hugely important players to a national championship team. It's almost happened in every national championship the last couple of years is a guy that's not overly talented or overly touted coming out of high school joins a team and is a huge part of their success in that national championship. That's obviously going to skew this a little bit. And maybe a team like Ole Miss that's not quite on that level but has brought in some elite talent from the portal, maybe they can find their way into that mix for this national title and break this streak. But I would bet it's going to be one of those teams that are above 50% in the blue chip ratio. I would bet it's going to be one of the teams above 60 unless Clemson can make it happen, which we'll get into. Definitely a team I'm looking at very closely, but if it's not Clemson, I think you're going to have to be above that 60% marker this year to get it done. But it's going to be really awesome to watch a number of different things that come from this. This is not the end all be all. Would love to see a 2007 type season where this is totally broken, but even in 2007, I bet you that LSU had enough guys to meet that 50% marker. But at the end of the day, going to be awesome to watch this unfold, and we'll see if it holds up this year. I tend to believe it will with all the teams up there, but we'll see. Definitely would be awesome to see that kind of fall apart and the chaos that would ensue. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we just got a little bit of a catch-up to do. We got Jake Retzlaff committing to Tulane. We got Tony Petitti kind of falling on his sword for Michigan just a little bit. We got Texas versus Georgia on the recruiting trail and plenty of other stuff right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the blue chip ratio, something that is a little bit nebulous in this time day and age, but at the end of the day, does prove that recruiting still wins battles. If you're above that 50% marker, you're probably in the group to win a national championship, especially if you're over 60, then you're probably in the elite group to win the national championship. But a lot of different things can happen. Kind of hope it gets broken up this year, but just don't see it happening, if I'm being totally honest. I still think recruiting from high school is the way to do it, and I think it's going to bear itself out this upcoming year. But we got a little bit of a catch-up to do. We got some things to talk about in the world of college football, and the biggest thing happened only a couple of days ago, and it is Jake Retzlaff has committed to Tulane. He will join them as a walk-on, kind of left BYU in some interesting circumstances. Got himself caught up in a little bit of a legal situation that has since been resolved, and he has found his way out of BYU. Wasn't able to get into the portal, but was able to enroll in Tulane. Sounds like he's showing up today. So sounds like he will be on campus today. They start fall camp, I believe, next Tuesday, so he'll be able to be there before camp, but he's got a lot of work to do. I'll be totally honest. You got a couple of guys in that room. I believe they've taken 5 different transfer quarterbacks this offseason. One has already found his way out with TJ Finley getting in to a little legal trouble himself. That is obviously a story that has gone around there quite a while. And then you have Caden Simonza, a very talented freshman coming off MAC Freshman of the Year last year at Ball State. Very talented kid. You have Brendan Sullivan coming over from Iowa, did some really good stuff for Iowa at times last year. This is going to be your best player. I feel very, very confident when I say that now. I think Caden Simonza is a guy that absolutely could get this job, at least early on. I think Jake Retzlaff's your best player. I don't think Tulane would have gotten him if he wasn't going to be the best player in that room to start things out. Will he start week 1 is a little bit up in the air. They do have Northwestern to start things off. They do come to Tulane, so that makes it a little bit easier, but not necessarily an easy landing for a group of 5 team. Then you go to South Alabama before back-to-back games with Duke coming to Tulane. That's a Darian Mensah return, which will be a show. There's no doubt about that. And then you go to Ole Miss. You're not winning the Ole Miss game. I'll just put that out there right now. If you do win the Ole Miss game, I will be on here wearing a Tulane shirt immediately. I can promise you that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be tough. He's going to be thrown into the fire immediately. He has to learn this offense very, very quickly because they're flying out of the gates. One way or the other, they're going to have to be able to win these games because this is a team that can get to the CFP. There's no doubt about that. You got to win one of those tough games to do it. You got to be able to beat South Alabama and then beat maybe Northwestern. Maybe you beat Duke. Maybe you find a way to beat Ole Miss. If you can come out of those 4 games 2-2, you're in really good shape. You're absolutely in good shape in the American, which actually did change their name this past week, which was weird. I always called it the American, but at the end of the day, you put yourself in a really great spot. If you're Tulane going forward, you definitely feel great about the position you're in, and this is going to be your best quarterback. This is going to be your most talented quarterback at the very least. Will he be up to speed fast enough for him to be starting in that Northwestern game is a little bit up in the air. I would bet yes. I would bet they brought this guy in and just said, we're going to learn as much as we can. We're going to learn this on the fly, but you're the most talented guy we have. That's the reason we brought you in so late on in the process. We need you to get ready to go. So I would bet it's going to be Jake Retzlaff from the jump. it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. If he comes out against Northwestern and throws a couple of picks early, is it Caden Simonza right then, or do they have a little bit of a leash for the guy that they brought in pretty late in the process? So that's going to be a fun thing to watch. I think Tulane is firmly in the conversation for a CFP, and this obviously helps that quite a bit. Then we got to talk about Memphis for a second. Memphis was denied from the Big 12. Sounds like they offered a pretty penny. $250 million was the reported amount that Memphis was willing to offer to the Big 12 to let them into the conference. The Big 12 turned around and said, no thanks. I have never seen that happen, frankly. I understand where the Big 12 is coming from for two different reasons. One, Memphis does not bring the TV deal stuff that a lot of other teams do. They would not bring what UCF has brought. They would not bring what BYU has brought. They wouldn't even bring what Cincinnati has brought in terms of a television deal product. Not to say Memphis isn't a great team, not to say they're not a great athletic department, because they're about as good as all the teams that I just named. But the reality is, the Memphis market is not a great market. It's not the biggest market in the world. It's not necessarily a fan base that you have to have. That's why they were giving $250 million to get into the conference. So it's not overly surprising to me in that realm. And the other part of this is, I think a lot of commissioners are looking around and saying, this is too big of a league. I think they understand even that this is 18 teams up in the Big 10 and 16 in the Big 12 and SEC and 17 in the ACC. I think they're just trying to get their ducks in a row with what they have now. I think they're trying to make sure that their teams can get through the House settlement, understand where that $20 million is coming from for every single team, and move forward from there. I think a lot of teams are just going to sit pat just for a little bit. Now, 2030, 2031, get ready for some fireworks. But I think for the time being, I think they're just trying to figure out their own stuff before they bring on anyone else. So I think Memphis has a path to get to one of these bigger conferences in time, but I just don't think right now is that time, especially for the Big 12 with a lot of different moving parts to make the money work going the next couple of years. Then we got Tony Petitti defending Michigan, which is words I didn't think I was going to be able to say, because Tony Petitti came down on them pretty aggressively the last couple of years, but he sounds like he has sent a letter to the NCAA, I believe Court of Infractions is what it's called, just saying, let's be done with this. Let's leave Michigan alone. Let's not go aggressively against Michigan. And this is what every commissioner would do. Let's just be totally honest. Michigan's one of the biggest products in the Big Ten. If he feels there's a world where they get a bowl ban or a postseason ban this upcoming year, he's going to find a way to make that not happen. Because if Michigan's in any position to get close to the CFP and they're left out because of a postseason ban, there's going to be a problem in Big Ten country. I can promise you that. So that's going to be a battle that we go back and forth on. What I will say, the Big Ten commissioner coming out in front of this and trying to make sure that they don't get punished more aggressively makes me think there's a punishment coming that's pretty aggressive. I'll just leave it at that for the time being. Don't know what's coming down. I don't think it's going to be absolutely devastating to the Michigan program. It might be enough. And this is something that definitely is something to watch. It should come here pretty soon, and maybe we'll be able to talk about it on Friday. If not, hopefully next week, but feels like something's coming down the pipe here pretty soon, and sounds like Tony Petitti is a little bit nervous about the Michigan Wolverines. Obviously, we'll figure it out, and we'll see if the NCAA has a leg to stand on in this case. Now we got to talk about this. This was the story that took Twitter and X and all of the different social apps by storm the last couple of days and the last couple of weeks, really. Texas recruiting has taken off in a number of different ways. In the last about 2 weeks, really 10 days, they've gotten Tyler Atkinson, the number one linebacker in the country, committed to Texas, and then you got followed very closely up by J.J. Johnson, a UGA commit, number one D lineman in the country. He flipped to Texas very shortly after, about 40 minutes after, and we did not know that was happening going into the day. I can promise you that. And then Texas, this past Sunday, added the number two running back in the country in Derek Cooper. And there was a lot of conversation about the NIL funds because the way these recruitments went down are not normal by any means. You know, Georgia was recruiting Tyler Atkinson for a very long time, pretty much since he was 14 years old. Georgia had been recruiting him. Texas comes in late in the process and was able to win out. And a lot of people have questions about that, as you would imagine. Kind of the same thing happened with Derek Cooper. Never took an official visit at Texas. Did take an unofficial back in April, so it's not like he's walking in blind to what Austin is, but definitely a very interesting thing, not a normal thing. I'm sure he will use that official visit at some point this season to go to Texas again, but definitely a very interesting thing. Not usually normal, the way that it unfolds in recruiting, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of conversation about Texas's NIL, how much they're spending. They're spending a lot of money, guys. Like, let's just be totally honest. Texas has the most money to spend of anyone in the entire country. They're going to flex their muscles in this new era that is really coming to them in a number of different ways. But the other thing that I do want to push back on just a little bit when we talk about these recruitments is not necessarily that NIL played no part or NIL was not a conversation. Of course it's a conversation, but there's a couple of different things that people have been saying over the last couple of days that I just think are a little bit disingenuous. And the first one is Steve Sarkisian. When he was at SEC Media Days this past week, he was talking about NIL and how you recruit kids today and how he said, we don't talk about NIL until the very end of the visit. We don't get to that conversation. We have so much other stuff to talk about that we don't talk about that stuff until we get to the end. And people call BS in a lot of different ways. And I tend to believe he's telling the truth. I tend to believe that every team that talks about NIL usually doesn't do it till the end. And frankly, you can wait to talk about NIL and still win the NIL battle by quite a bit. Let's just be totally honest. That's the way this business works. So the reality is, Texas has no problem putting up money for these players. That was never going to be a problem. I know there were stories about they were using the money to retain the roster. That was more just covering people's asses. Let's just be totally honest. But at the end of the day, there has been a kind of conversation around recruiting really over the last couple of years, and it's something that has always been a little bit frustrating to me. I understand the sentiment of where it's coming from, but it's the reality that if a kid takes the highest NIL offer on the table, he is then a bad teammate. He is then a bad kid. He is then someone that's going to transfer out, or they're going to lose, or he's going to decommit. And it's not to say that doesn't happen. It's not to say there aren't kids out there that take the biggest NIL money just because it's the biggest NIL money, and that's the end-all be-all, no question about it. That's not the reality at Texas. Whether or not you like Texas is totally by the wayside for 1 second. This team has had the most players drafted over the last 2 years. They've had the most running backs drafted in terms of Derek Cooper. They've had the most running backs drafted over the last 3 years with 5 different guys from Texas going to the NFL from the running back position. They're the only team in the country with back-to-back CFP appearances, and a lot of kids want to be the one that breaks through and wins that first national title at a program that's really yearning for one like Texas. It's not crazy to think that these kids would say, the NIL money's good and I can do all this incredible stuff. I'm going to find my way to Texas. That is not a far-fetched thing. Tyler Atkinson, I'm sure he's watching a lot of Anthony Hill tape and saying that can be me in a year or two. I'm sure Derek Cooper, I heard he talked to Bijan Robinson. Have to assume that helped quite a bit, knowing that he went to Texas. They're not similar backs necessarily, but both have that shiftiness, both have that ability. Derek Cooper is picturing himself going 8th overall in the NFL draft. So here's the reality. Texas has all the money in the world to spend. You would not imagine the amount of money that Texas is spending right now in terms of NIL. And the biggest problem I have with it, the biggest problem I think a lot of people have with it is we just don't know what the numbers are. We don't know what everyone is spending. We know that there's a revenue share deal of $20.5 million that you're allowed to allocate however you see fit. And Texas is taking part in that. They also have a lot of money on top of that. Let's just be totally honest. They have probably about, I don't want to put an outright number out there because then it'll seem like I have the number. I don't know what the number is. I know they're spending a lot of money, and I know they have all the money to spend, and they will continue to have all the money to spend regardless of the regulations around this thing. Just going to put as plain as it can be, Texas is going to be able to swing a big stick in this time and age. There's no doubt about that. So there's a little bit of a battle back and forth. I don't love the state of college football recruiting right now. I don't love the way that NIL is a huge, huge part of the conversation. But when we talk about these kids, we have to try to restrain ourselves from looking at a dollar figure, looking at a kid and saying, because that dollar figure is high, that is not a high character kid. Tyler Atkinson, it sounds like the number is about $1.5 million. Another thing I want to say real quickly, Tyler Atkinson Great player, incredible player. If he's making $1.5 million, I think he is well worth that money. I can promise you that. But what I'm going to say, the agents that release these numbers have every single reason to tell you a higher number than is reality. They have every single reason to say a $1 million contract, really a $2 million contract, or a $1.5 million contract, actually $3 million. We saw it happen with Felix Ojo. I think we're seeing it happen with a couple other guys in this recruiting cycle, but that's a totally other point for another day. My point is, we don't know what the numbers are. We don't know how this unfolded, and frankly, we don't know what these kids are going to be. I think Tyler Atkinson is going to be an incredible player, an incredible leader, and one of the best players on Texas for the next 3 years. I think he is that good. I think he's going to be one of the best linebackers to come through Texas in a very long time. I'll just be totally honest. I think he is that type of game changer. I think Derek Cooper is going to be an elite running back. It sounds like the number might have been around $2 million. Again, questionable number, but at the end of the day, if it is, I think he's worth that money. He's an incredible, incredible player. I think he's going to be an incredible leader for that team. And I think when you look at these kids right now, a lot of people are comparing it to A&M in 2022, and they're saying everyone's going to leave that program because that's what happened at A&M. A&M didn't have what the CFP appearances. They didn't have 25 guys getting drafted over the last 2 years. They didn't have 5 running backs getting drafted over the last 3 years. They didn't have all the other stuff that Texas has to sell. So I'm not saying all of these guys are totally going to work out. I'm not saying all of these guys are going to stick around at Texas. I'm saying I'd bet they're going to stick around at Texas. I'm saying I bet that Texas is going to be able to be good enough to win enough games and to put these guys in winning positions where they're going to feel pretty good about their decision. And yes, they made a lot of money in this process. These kids should. Let's just be totally honest. At the end of the day, this is a free market approach, and it gets messy. There's no doubt about that. But Texas did come into this recruitments, or these number of recruitments, late in the process, and they were able to win them out, and NIL played a role. There's no two ways about that. If you think NIL was the only thing pulling these kids to Texas, you're out of your mind. I'll just be totally honest with you. It is not something that is happening in Texas right now. I think they're going to be very, very happy with themselves that they invested the money in Tyler Atkinson, that they invested the money in Derek Cooper, that they invested the money in J.J. Johnson. I think all those guys are going to be awesome, and I think no one is going to be upset that they went out and got him, except Georgia maybe. Georgia's going to be a little bit frustrated, and that's a rivalry that's forming before our eyes, really, and a little bit complicated for myself. But at the end of the day, it's going to be awesome to watch this unfold. Texas is going to make some more people mad. I can almost promise you that. I think there's going to be a couple other recruitments that Texas finds a way to get themselves involved with that not a lot of people think they're going to be involved with. But that's something we can talk about in time. A lot of people are going to be mad at Texas, and that's just the reality for the Texas Longhorns the vast majority of the time. But incredible thing happening off the field. It's always fun when recruiting is battles. Not so much fun when it has NIL involved with it, but that's always going to be a part of the conversation. I say we just enjoy the players and try to not bury them too much for taking a good amount of money. Then we got to talk about this. We just talked about NIL being a little bit out of control. It sounds like President Trump is looking towards possibly signing an executive order to get it under control. Now, all of this is very unknown right now. What that looks like, what the number would be, even that's even allowed, frankly, in a lot of different ways, because like we just talked about, it's a free market. You know, you have guys in the NBA, you have guys in the NFL that sign endorsement deals. You can't really tell them they can't. So that's going to be a complicated thing. If you fix the tie between the schools and NIL, then maybe you have a little bit better of a way going about it. It'll be a little bit sketchy. Let's just be totally honest. It's going to be very interesting to watch that unfold. I think there's a way to do this right. I also think there's a way to make this just a little bit longer of a process than it has to be, but definitely going to be interesting to watch, something that could at least bring momentary relief to a lot of the problems that people have around the college sport right now. And then I did want to talk about Corey Adams before we got out of here. The freshman defensive end over there at Ole Miss was killed in a fatal shooting in Cordova, Tennessee this past week, right outside of Memphis. Devastating news. Not much more to say here. Don't want to go on this long soliloquy, but just wanted to send thoughts and prayers out to the Adams family, to the Ole Miss program. Played at Edna Carr in New Orleans, an incredible high school program, a remarkably talented kid, and a kid that was taken from us too soon. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to him, quick condolences and thoughts to his family in this time, and I'm sure there will be a really, really cool ceremony, a cool moment for that family once season does roll around, but just a terrible loss. A young kid that had a really, really bright future ahead of him, and it was taken away just a little bit too early. Wanted to make sure I gave that shout out before we got out of here because he definitely deserves to be talked about as we get closer to college football season. But a lot of stuff going on, guys. There's about a million things to talk about. We have Big Ten and ACC media days going on right now. A lot of stuff to talk about coming out of that. A lot of stuff with the SEC to talk about. And we'll get into that on Friday, I promise you that. But a lot of different things going on. We'll talk about all of this different type of stuff. Hopefully we get some type of NIL relief at some point. I don't think it's coming too soon, but we'll see what happens there. We'll see if we can get a little bit better of a cap on all of this stuff. But we will be back on Friday. On Friday, we're going to go through my top 10 quarterbacks in college football. We'll do that buy-sell segment that I was talking about with teams I'm buying and teams I'm selling for the upcoming season, and we'll do everything in between. We'll talk about media days and all that fun stuff, and we'll be very close to football. We'll be less than a month away from football by the next time we speak, so look forward to it. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.